the second to last week in our 7-week fall series, just about done, one more to go. And we've been learning the keys to becoming more resilient, better able to bounce back from the inevitable setbacks that are part of the human condition, especially in a rapidly changing world. Today we're going to talk about courage and aspiration. And for me, the first thing that I think of when I hear the word courage usually has something to do with facing situations that involve some kind of threat to life and limb. I think, well, it's Veterans Day weekend, I think of soldiers, first of all, but firefighters, first responders, and things like that. That's the kind of courage that immediately comes to mind, or perhaps it might be the kind of courage like we see here, which is an interesting form of courage. It says, do one brave thing today and then run like hell. And for our listeners out there, what we're looking at here is a picture of a penguin holding a pair of cymbals, getting ready to clash them together while standing behind a very large sleeping polar bear. One can only imagine what is going to happen next. Might be courageous, but it's definitely not very smart, which that sometimes happens too. Well, that's not the kind of courage they're talking about in this chapter of the book. Really, either one of those kinds of courage. This is a concept of courage that I think most of us are going to be more likely to encounter in daily living because it has to do with our relationships. It has to do with our dealings with others. What they're suggesting here is that it takes courage to communicate clearly, completely, and honestly in a relationship. So it means in this context that we feel safe enough, strong enough, confident enough to be able to say what needs to be said with the skill that it takes to do so without making things worse. It truly is a skill when we look at it that way. You know, that penguin there, by the way, was not about to improve relationships with that polar bear, right? You may say it was courageous, but definitely not a very skillful use of communication. Don't do that. One of the biggest barriers to open and effective communication is the memory of things that went wrong in the past, right? That's what haunts us. Painful memories of communications failures can bring up fear when we face a similar situation now. Ideally, we're supposed to learn from those experiences, right? We're supposed to learn from the bad experiences, the painful experiences. There's supposed to be something that can help us to grow, but that can prove to be difficult when the experience brings up so much discomfort that we try to suppress it and avoid it. You're not going to learn from something that way. So maybe instead of trying to fix what went wrong in the past, maybe it's a better idea to work on a new skill set going forward. And the first thing that they recommend in the book is practicing something that he calls wise communication. Now, this is drawing on something in the Buddhist tradition that is known as the Eightfold Path, especially number 3 on the Eightfold Path, which is right speech. Wise communication, right speech. Dr. Hansen, who wrote this book, draws a lot on Buddhist tradition. In fact, he wrote an entire book prior to this called Buddha's Brain, so that's one of his go-to areas. Wise speech, I think, is a good translation of what they mean by right speech. And it consists of 6 elements. And we've got all these listed out for you in the handout in your bulletin, so if you want to follow along today, we had a few PowerPoint slides that got lost in the mail, so to speak, so we have it there in writing, though. Wise speech consists of the following elements. It's well-intended, it's true, beneficial, timely, not harsh, and wanted. So let's go ahead and unpack those. Well-intended. That means that what we're saying is aimed at helping, not hurting, and above all is not based on ill will. We're not trying to get back. This is not a matter of revenge or things like that. And doing this, making sure that our speech is well intended, it requires a well-developed sense of self-awareness. We need to be able to be open and honest. We have to make an honest assessment of our motives and our demeanor. Am I feeling angry, defensive, vengeful, aggressive? If the answer to any of those questions is yes, then maybe we should proceed cautiously, be prepared to insert some pauses into the conversation. Those will give us an opportunity to make sure that we're operating from what we like to call the responsive zone, the green zone, instead of the reactive or red zone, which is where those things like defensiveness, aggression, anger come from. We covered this back during week 2, so we want to be able to operate from the green zone. So we insert pauses into the conversation. It's important because in the heat of the moment, it can be difficult to make that kind of translation, to be able to move from red zone to green zone. We want to give ourselves some time because it's easy to get swept away, which is why the pause can be so beneficial. Does anyone remember when they were young hearing the advice to count to 10 as a way of controlling your temper? That's actually something that Thomas Jefferson said. I didn't know who that was from. Thomas Jefferson talked about it. But there was a little bit more to it. What Thomas Jefferson actually said was that count to 10, but if you're angry, count to 100. That was the full quote. Well, either way, 10 or 100, it works, especially if we remember to breathe at the same time. And from a biological standpoint, they tell us that it takes just a mere 6 seconds between something that triggers us and the full-blown ego-based reaction, which is usually not a good thing. 6 seconds. It's actually a lot of time when you think about it. 6 seconds is a lot of time. It's more than enough time to insert that pause if we train ourselves to do it. It's more than enough time to stop and consciously make a decision to breathe a few times. Take 3 or 4 breaths, long, slow breaths from the belly. Hey, why not a 10 count just for good measure to go along with that? The breathing does something else that's very important. Well, other than the obvious answer that breathing is a good thing. As the Buddha once said, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. Forget this, and attaining enlightenment will be the least of your problems. I don't think he actually said that, but I think he should have. The fact, though, is that from a biological standpoint, slow, deep breaths bring about a physical change in the brain. Neuroscience has demonstrated that when we face a threat, that threat triggers something called the sympathetic nervous system, which is basically autopilot, right? That is the flight or fight, which is not the best system to be running the show when clear, compassionate, and rational communication is called for. So what deep breathing does is it stimulates another part of the brain, another part of the nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system, which is what allows our higher brain functions to come back online, which will give us the opportunity to step back and to be able to intentionally move into that responsive green zone, which is where we want to be. So once we're there, we want to make sure, the next step, number 2, we want to make sure that what we're saying is true, which is the question of are we being accurate and honest? And even if it is accurate and honest, we still have to make sure that it's well intended. And then we move on to the third element where we ask, is it beneficial? Is it either useful or enjoyable in some way? It may be true, but if it doesn't pass the other test questions, we need to reconsider. We need to take another look at it. The communication also needs to be timely. What we have to say can be well-intended, it can be true, but it's not likely to be beneficial if we choose an inappropriate time to say it. For example, it might be helpful for someone to know that they have a soup stain on their tie, but telling them that in front of a room full of people, or just a mere few seconds before they're supposed to stand up and speak before an audience, is probably not the best timing for something like that. Could just possibly add to the stress, anxiety, and self-consciousness. So what they're saying here is a little discretion. The next one is not harsh. That may sound obvious, but Sometimes it's difficult to discern between being firm and passionate versus being overbearing and threatening. They say in the book, they put it like this. They say it's not so much what we say as how we say it. And the fact is that our tone can completely negate our good intentions. So we need to pay attention to that. And finally, the last element here is that we have to give some consideration to whether what we have to say is wanted. This should not be, we shouldn't treat this as having veto power over the whole situation, but we need to take it into consideration. It shouldn't be an obstacle, because the fact is that people often do not want to hear difficult things that need to be said. So this is like a cost-benefit analysis. We're kind of weighing it here. They may not want to hear it, but what is the likelihood that they will accept it anyway? That's what we're looking at here. If the likelihood that they'll accept it anyway, if that likelihood is high, go ahead. But if you have a good sense that they're just going to shut you down, or if it's going to make the situation worse, then consider the option of silence instead of wasting your energy on what could prove to be an exercise in futility. That's what they mean by, is it wanted? Now, before leaving the topic of courage, I want to mention something from the book. It's a topic that the author devotes several pages to. It's called nonviolent communication. I'm not even going to attempt to summarize it here, because it really requires more than just one talk to do it justice, which is something that we're going to do in January. We're going to cover nonviolent communication in depth after the first of the year. We'll revisit the topic, but for today we need to move on to aspiration. The chapter on aspiration starts with a quote from the poem The Summer Day by Mary Oliver. I know a lot of you are familiar with the poem, but there's this famous line which says, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" What is it that you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? What are our dreams, our ambitions? To what do we aspire? Aspiration. You know, an interesting thing happens when we play around with the origin of the word aspire. It's actually a combination of two Latin words, ad, meaning to, and the word spirare, which means to breathe. So it literally means to breathe. So if you're going to aspire to anything, once again, it would be to keep breathing, like I mentioned earlier. But another way of looking at it possibly is to ask, what is it that makes you breathe hard? Now that can lead to some strange places, but think about it. What is it that you desire so much that it would cause you to expend the kind of effort that a mountain climber would put out in that last push to reach the summit? I think that's what they're getting at here. The message in this chapter is that it's okay to dream big so long as you can remain fundamentally at peace with whatever happens. A couple of weeks ago I mentioned that our culture has this unhealthy relationship with failure, right? Calling someone a failure is used as a put noun. It's almost like it's a moral judgment. Failure is never supposed to be an option, right? You've heard that. Failure is not an option, but the truth is just the opposite. Failure is always an option. Failure is always an option, and there are always some things that are simply out of our control. Nothing that we can do about it. Things may not go according to plan, but there are some ways that we can avoid this idea of failure being a stigma or a put down and still be at peace with the results. So in the book, they recommend an exercise that I would describe like this, and I know this is going to sound a little bit like some kind of a shallow New Age platitude, but it's actually very practical and based in reality. So here it is. We want to make sure that our aspirations are grounded in the truth of our being. We want to make sure that our aspirations are grounded in the truth of our being. It starts with taking an inventory of three things. Things we enjoy, things that we're good at, and things that are important to us. We get a list of all the things that fit into those categories, what we enjoy, what we're good at, and what's important to us. I mean, why on earth, think about this, why on earth would anyone choose to do something that they didn't enjoy, weren't good at, and wasn't important to them? But sometimes we kind of find our way, kicking through life doing stuff, and we really think about it, we ask, why the heck am I doing this? Talk about setting yourself up for disappointment and frustration. So ideally, we want to have our aspirations, our dreams, our ambitions to be grounded in the place where at least two of those categories come together, where they overlap. And even better yet, the ideal space is where all three of them come together. It's like a Venn diagram we've given you in the handout in your bulletin. There's a plus sign in the middle, which I call the sweet spot. That's where those things all come together. That's the intersection of what I enjoy, what I'm good at, and what's important to me. Actually, I think it might be accurate to say that what we really want is for all areas of our lives to be grounded in that sweet spot, in the plus zone, as much as possible. And in the book, they suggest looking at three specific areas in our lives and doing a self-assessment to see where they fall in that category. Our relationships, our work, and our play. In so much as is possible, if we can somehow ground those three areas in that sweet spot, that's going to make life a whole lot better. That's going to help with resilience. That's going to make our aspirations grounded in the reality of who we are. And if something there is missing, what can we do to change that? We may take on a dream or an ambition and realize that, well, I'm not really good at this. Well, we can always do something about that. We can always learn how to do something. We can learn a new skill. So we go back to the concept of agency, which we covered back in week 3. If a situation isn't the way we want it to be, what can we realistically do to bring about a different result? What can we do to be a change agent in our own lives? And as they say in the book, the thing to remember here is that the days may be long and the years short, but it's never too late to try something new. So that's all for today. We're going to wrap it up next week with generosity and our Thanksgiving potluck. We'll be having a discussion group after the service at 11:30 here in the sanctuary, because I know the prosperity team is meeting in the youth area. The meditation will be online tomorrow, so you can work with that, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.